Having watched the cases of crowd disasters from the first half of the series, you might be feeling horrified, and reasonably so. You might also be feeling somewhat guilty for having watched these incredibly painful, perhaps even final moments of people's lives. But it wasn't for naught, nor was it for mere morbid fascination. We watched that footage that we might learn from it, that we might survive similar situations in the future, and so that, through prudent planning, we might prevent them from happening altogether. So at this point in the series, we'll be abstracting a few lessons from the horrific situations we've just watched. These first few lessons will focus on what we as members of a crowd can do to remain safe. The latter lessons will focus more on what event organizers and venue architects might do to prevent crowd crushes and collapses. So, Lesson 1. Cultivate situational awareness. Worse than obvious, it might sound callous to point this out, as if I'm saying that the people involved in these tragedies did not indeed have situational awareness, but I'm not saying that. Many of them surely had well-developed situational awareness. What I am saying, rather, is that without this awareness, you may not survive long enough to ever even utilize these other lessons. If not a sufficient condition for survival, situational awareness may still be necessary. Like our cameraman in the nightclub station fire, know when you are faced with imminent danger and know when it is time to move. Be aware of when the crowd you're in is building up to a critical density, then leave it. Be aware if this crowd is moving toward a bottleneck. Listen to your gut. If your gut says that this situation feels unsafe, then listen to it. All of this brings me directly to Lesson 2. Have an escape plan. Familiarize yourself with the evacuation plans of venues or other buildings, especially if you know that the crowds therein may reach critically dense levels. In the case of a fire or some other emergency, you can't afford to be stuck waiting in a column of people all trying to escape through the same bottleneck exit. So familiarize yourself with alternate exits, windows included. Better to break a nightclub's window than to die in a nightclub. On this same note, venue officials need to clearly designate exits and make attendees aware of those exits and of egress routes. The onus should not be on those visiting a venue to protect themselves from the dangers inherent in the venue's architecture or crowd control planning. Lesson 3. Be assertive. You need to be assertive about your own health because very few people, if any, will do that for you. If you need to escape a fire by getting through a stage exit, and if that is your only viable means of escape, then assert yourself, whatever that might take. It may not even mean having to fight someone so much as telling a bouncer, "Hey, if you do not let some of us through this exit, we will die." Be clear and don't mitigate your speech. If your life is on the line, then there is no need to be polite about it or to minimize the fact of the danger. Furthermore, you need to be assertive in order to overcome peer pressure. In the case of crowd disasters, peer pressure may very well lead to asphyxiative pressure. If your situational awareness tells you to get out of a crowd ASAP to avoid an imminent crisis, and a friend of yours is trying to persuade you to ignore your gut instinct as well as your rational mind, then you need to be assertive with that friend. Again, no one will advocate for your own health as well as you will, so you need to advocate for yourself. At the same time, if you know damn well that a crisis is about to occur, communicate this fact clearly and assertively to your friends, loved ones, or even strangers around you, if by doing so you can save their lives. Lesson 4. Move laterally. If you find yourself becoming fixed within a critically dense crowd, then your best way to escape it will not be by moving backwards against it, but by moving with it and laterally to the side, toward the edge of the crowd. The result will be a diagonal movement through the crowd until you are in a less dense area or outside of the crowd completely. If the crowd is surging, you may have to employ the so-called accordion technique, whereby, in between surges, you take advantage of spaces made by the surge to move laterally before being impeded by the next surge, and then repeat. As you do so, be sure to keep your arms up in something like a boxer's stance in order to keep some space between yourself and others, as well as to protect your rib cage from compressive forces. Better a fractured arm than a broken rib and the inability to breathe. Lesson 5. Rigid fetal position. Obviously, the best advice would be to stay on your feet and not fall in the first place. If you drop something in a dangerously dense crowd, it may be best to just leave it. But if you do fall amidst a crowd, or worst of all, if you get caught under a crowd collapse, there is a technique to improve your survival odds in that situation. Let's listen to part of an account from Mike Vargas, a survivor of the station nightclub fire.
Realizing the danger, he began moving away from the stage, working his way through the crowd, back toward the front entrance of the club. Were you hurrying? Were you...
No, I stayed calm, because I figured the doorway, it's not a big club, and I wasn't, when you start walking towards the door, it's not that far away.
And was it getting smoky?
Yes. Before the lights went out, gray smoke came across the room, and right behind the gray smoke was flames. When the lights went out, that's when the panic hit.
So a crush has begun.
Oh, the crowd was
moving toward the door.
People started screaming, "Get out, get out, get out." People started pushing and shoving. That's when I got pushed down, and I fell down against the wall. And I just...
From the crush of people behind you?
Yes. As soon as I fell forward, it was pitch black.
He had almost reached the front door, but the stampeding crowd had created a lethal bottleneck. The exit blocked by a tangled pile of those who had fallen trying to escape. In a matter of moments, Mike found himself buried beneath an unmovable mountain, 5 feet high, layer upon layer of people with no way out.
And I could feel the people and the pressure building up on me. And it was just the bodies piling one on top of another, just trying to get out. I said, "Oh my God, I don't want to die like this." But then I realized panicking is not going to help me out of this. So the best thing to do, my best chance to survive, is to stay calm.
And what kind of a position were you in?
I was on my side. I always knew never lay on your stomach or lay on your back, because you can suffocate. You won't be able to breathe. At least on your side, you can still breathe.
So you were in kind of a fetal position?
Yes.
At the bottom of this pile?
I was in a fetal position with my knees up against the wall. I started feeling embers and stuff burning on me, on my left leg. It wasn't painful. It was more irritating than anything.
Could you move?
No, I was wedged in there. I had my hands up like this. I was able to move stuff away from my face if I needed to. And I had a small little air pocket right in front of me.
And what about the people?
What Mike did to survive is what we would call a rigid fetal position, where you lie on your side, tuck your head and knees inward, and use your arms to cover your head as well as the area around your chest, thus preserving your ability to breathe. In Mike's case, he was saved by a combination of this rigid fetal position and the heat shield inadvertently created by the massive bodies lying atop him. Those are 5 takeaway lessons that you might incorporate into your own crowd navigation practices. However, there are certainly more out there, and the more time I spend on them, the more I feel like I'm instructing victims of an institutional damage on how to survive the institution, rather than address the institution itself in order to nip the damage in the bud. So now I'll address the steps that can be taken by venues in order to ensure crowd safety at an event. Number 1. Invest more in consulting from crowd control specialists. This is the easiest step to take, but it requires that a venue owner acknowledge that they are probably not an expert at crowd control and safety, and that they should listen to the advice of others. After all, crowd control is a legitimate field of science being driven by some truly illuminating research. The very least that a venue owner can do is hear out the recommendations of such an expert in this field. Number 2. Confront the real potential consequences of bottleneck architecture and festival seating, and, if possible, make necessary changes. For bottlenecks, this may involve widening corridors or opening more exits at the end of a corridor. For festival seating, this may mean switching to a kind of assigned seating if the venue allows it, or perhaps staggering entrance times. Number 3. Use screens, speakers, or other media to communicate with the crowd. In too many of these crush cases, it seems like the crowd is operating on very limited or perhaps even outdated information, and without recourse to a knowledgeable source which might guide them to safety. Venues such as Red Rocks have very large screens by the stage as well as capable sound systems. They can be used to help people as much as to entertain them. Number 4. D barriers, especially around mosh pit areas, vary the entry points into a particular area and thus aid in controlling the ingress and egress of dense crowds. Furthermore, D barriers segment the crowd and thus help mitigate the compressive forces of a crowd, insofar as the compressive forces are directly proportional to the combined weight of the crowd. A crowd segmented is a combined weight segmented, and thus a force reduced. D barriers were made mandatory for larger capacity shows at the Australian music festival Big Day Out, following a disastrous show by Limp Bizkit at which the 16-year-old Jessica Mihalik died from none other than a massive crowd crush. Number 5. This final item may be the hardest to cultivate and implement, but may perhaps be the most important: an intentional culture. This isn't to say that a music venue needs to have morning staff yoga sessions or mindfulness retreats. Rather, it means that the venue staff, administrators, featured artists, and even the crowd itself should internalize a respect for safety and for human well-being. The opposite of this is, of course, an externalized violence or maybe an utter indifference to the well-being of others. Given the choice between a culture that values health and safety and one that operates on the mechanics of moral anomie or antipathy, the choice should be obvious. The former conduces to memorable concert experiences, felt humanity, and practiced care and compassion. But perhaps these descriptions feel lofty and stripped of specificity. So let's be specific. Intentional cultures are not merely the result of the behaviors and beliefs of the members of a crowd or organization, but they are instead continually aligned and emphasized by the leaders of said organization. In the context of, say, a musical event like a concert or a festival, there is no more conspicuous leader than the musicians themselves. One study, detailed in the article Influences on Crowd Behavior at Outdoor Music Festivals, drew on the reports of well-trained and experienced security personnel to understand what they considered to be the factors determining safety risks at outdoor music festivals. According to these security personnel, one of the greatest causes of public health risks at outdoor music festivals behind intoxication and crowd crushes is crowd behavioral issues. And the most significant determining factors that influence crowd behavior are the music and performers themselves. So it's worth looking at some cases of performers and how they can differently influence crowd behavior and to what ends. Now, it's easy to look at performers who have been, shall we say, less than helpful, and understand how they exacerbated a problem. It isn't difficult to take a stage and to rile up a crowd with your music, or to become combative with even organizers, or to trivialize attempts of medical professionals to offer assistance to the crowd. And honestly, most of these cases already have entire videos devoted to them, because that is typically what people are interested in seeing when things go wrong. So, having just skimmed over, at least visually, some of the less than helpful cases, I would rather spend a few moments looking at the more helpful cases, yet with a critical lens. First, consider Red Hot Chili Peppers at the Big Day Out in 2000. I'll play this video first, then make some comments on it.
It's not uncommon in a festival situation for people to get crushed like grapes up at the front. There's really not a lot you can do about it, because asking everybody to step back is not very potent of a solution. But if you could just bear in mind that you don't want to hurt somebody, that you don't want to inflict difficulty in somebody breathing in mind, and just change the whole vibe out there so no one's getting crushed. No one's getting hurt, no one's getting crushed. See, now it's getting ugly. You know what? Just do as little violence as possible right now. Don't make it worse, make it better. Don't get mean, get nice. Seriously though. Hey, You sending in all the troops. Don't look at this like a violent mission. Look at this as like a peaceful mission. Make this a peaceful mission right now, please, everybody.
The band was aware of the dangerous conditions in the crowd, and they stopped their set to address it. Anthony didn't make inflammatory comments, he didn't attack anyone. Instead, he realized the inherent dangers of such a dense crowd in a festival seating environment. And props to him for using the word crush rather than stampede. And he urged authorities to treat this as more of a rescue mission than an antagonistic one. However, there are some issues. At least in words, he contradictorily assigns a certain amount of agency to the crowd. Contradictory because while he acknowledges that it is less than potent to ask people to take a few steps back, presumably given their inability to move, he urges a changing of the vibe. The truth is that the people at the front of the crowd likely had little agency in how to act insofar as they are being pressed from behind, and thus most they could do was react in a way that would allow them to breathe better. That isn't irrational behavior, it's not a bad vibe, it's not behavior that you can ask those people to just not do. If you need to breathe, you're going to try to breathe. That's it. Perhaps more effective would have been to address the practicalities of the situation by asking the crowd from the very back to begin moving backwards. He is, after all, the authoritative source of information here. Whereas the security was ineffectively pushing the crowd back from the front, it would have possibly had more of an impact to ask the crowd starting from the back to move several steps backwards, if possible, and to ask them to not push forward thereafter, despite the appearance of space opening up ahead of them. This may seem like I'm asking a lot of a crowd, but this is part of what I mean by the cultivation of the intentional safety culture. It's not enough for the nominative authorities of an organization to attempt to continually align the organization in the direction of safety and well-being. Rather, the principles of safety and well-being need to be internalized and continually aligned by the members of the organization as well. The members of a crowd are, in a very real, albeit temporary way, the members of an organization. And it's not far-fetched to expect that a member of one music audience might very well be a member of many more audiences in the future. In a way, then, such a person is a perpetual member of the live music culture, and if we are to expect such cultures to address health and safety in a meaningful and holistic way, then it's incumbent upon members of a crowd to internalize the aforementioned principles of safety as much as it is incumbent upon the performers and event organizers to do the same. Don't get me wrong though, the event organizers have the greatest upstream impact on the prevention of such safety risks like crowd crush. However, it's probably the performers and crowd members themselves who have the greatest downstream role in advocating for their own safety when the situation is occurring. One of the principles that we ought to internalize, then, is that if there's a crush situation occurring at the front of the crowd, then we at the back need to move back and stay back in order to relieve pressure ahead of us. This imperative is not appealing if our goal is to be closer to a stage. It is very appealing, however, if our goal is to care for each other and prevent harm to our fellow human beings. It may seem like wishful thinking to expect crowds of people to act rationally and with compassionate concern for their fellow human beings. However, it's really not. It is an attitude that can be internalized and practiced with enough reinforcement. Consider, for example, certain communities and their driving habits. In my own city, there is at least a noticeable tendency for drivers from two different adjacent lanes to zipper into a single lane when required to do so, a behavior that can be reinforced by signage, government or employer training, and peer pressure. There is also a tendency for drivers to pull off to the side of the road and make way for ambulances and fire trucks. Granted, crowds at musical performances will be subject to different pressures than drivers on the road will be, for instance, increased likelihood of being intoxicated, hopefully. However, it should be obvious that it's not impossible for human beings to internalize crowd safety principles and actually put those principles into practice. It would be foolish perhaps to expect this kind of behavior from everyone. However, some is better than none, and it may mean the difference between life and death. Now, let's take a second look at the case from the very beginning of this series, Oasis at Manchester in 2005. I won't rehash the details of the event nor replay the full video, but let's check out this one important part of the clip.
That ain't too good.
Whoa, 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 whoa.
Turn on the song.
Yeah, before we go any further, all you've got to do is anybody falls down, pick them up, because it's going to get fucking nuts. Yeah, now listen everybody, right, this is serious. There's a crack in the barrier at the front, right, so they're going to have to get it sorted out before they're going to let us play. So everyone's going to have to take a walk back, right? Listen, that's just the way it is. The barrier's busted. They're going to have to fix it or we can't do the gig, all right? There you go. If you take 2 or 3 steps back from the back, we'll get it sorted and we'll get on with it and we'll fucking tear the roof off. Everybody move back, come on. I just realised we haven't got a roof on the place, but never mind, that's attention to detail there, don't worry about that.
Noel acknowledges the issue. He establishes firm terms for what it will take to continue the show, then tells the audience to take 2 or 3 steps from the back. I actually really admire Noel's handling of the situation. He was undoubtedly aware of the dangers of crowd crush, not only due to being a rock star, but also due to the infamous Hillsborough Stadium disaster, of which he was definitely aware. And he understood that it was perhaps far more important to address the back of the crowd rather than the front, because, after all, the front of the crowd was composed of corporeal beings who could not pass through each other. And rather than itch to get right back into the music, he relieved the tension with humor. So this video emphasizes one of the important crowd safety principles that needs to be internalized by performers. People at the front of a dense crowd cannot move. It is the people at the back who need to be addressed first and foremost. Let's look at one more example, this one being of Eminem and Big Proof in Washington, D.C. in 2002. M stops the show when he notices or is told that the crowd is pushing dangerously to the front, and he urges the crowd to calm down and back up so that the show may continue. As reported by the Baltimore Sun, the surging crowd continued to push, crushing against the stage. There was nowhere we could go. Everybody was pushing down, trying to get out, says Justin Kornmeyer, 17, of Hanover, Pennsylvania. People were screaming. There were girls getting trampled. People came from every direction.
Hey, yo, hold on. Stop it, man, stop it. Y'all gotta calm the fuck down. Hey, yo. Y'all gotta quit pushing towards the fucking front or we cannot perform. I got police telling me that the show is canceled if y'all don't stop pushing towards the front. You guys gotta calm the fuck down so we can do the show. Now, hey yo, if you got somebody on the ground in front of you, help them up. Help them up off the ground, because we cannot continue the show.
Now, clearly, Eminem and Big Proof recognized the danger posed to the crowd by itself, but their warning to the crowd did not prevent people from being crushed. After all, consider these two aspects of his warning: calm down and stop pushing. Telling fans to calm down may make no difference at all if the greater compressive forces are being applied from behind by crowd members who are indeed already calm, albeit eager, and who sense no danger further into the crowd. And in the case of a crowd collapse at the front, this will open space behind the collapse, giving people further back the reasonable impression that there is room to move forward. That is to say, they would not even be aware that they are indeed pushing against anyone. They are simply moving forward. So it's safe to say that good intentions in trying are not enough. What also needs to be cultivated and exercised is a particular kind of intelligence and understanding regarding crowd psychology and venue architecture. I understand that that may be a controversial take, but I'd suggest that a musician who is selling out a stadium really ought to make the effort to cultivate this understanding. It could save the lives of some of their fans, as well as save the musician from a lawsuit. Here, I hope I've made clear that an intentional safety culture isn't unilateral to the performer or to the crowd, but must involve bilateral participation. Anything less is humanity working with one arm tied behind its back. I have enough material concerning crowd crush and collapse to create at least one more unique video on the subject, and that's what I'm going to do. This third video will focus more on some of the ongoing and interesting research being conducted in crowd science. In this video, I'll extend the topics I've covered in the first two videos, particularly the topic of intentional culture and the internalization of principles and continual alignment of practices.